Hello, good evening. We are broadcasting live from Sturm Hall in the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. Thank you all for joining us both on Zoom and here in Sturm Hall, the home of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. I am Rhonda Gonzalez, and I am the Dean of the College, and I'm delighted to kick off our annual faculty and community event. This event is designed to share with our CAHSS community and beyond the research and creative works that are happening within our college. Tonight, we will hear about arts and video games, student research and veterans communities, racial discrepancies in pain care, and how denial can lead to the perpetuation of misinformation and patterns of violence and inequality. As you will see, the four faculty members presenting tonight represent a variety of disciplines from across the college, but each one demonstrates how our college is working toward DU's mission of being a private university dedicated to the public good. One quick note before we officially get started, we are live streaming this lecture on Zoom and recording it as well. The recording will be made available on YouTube and on our website. With that, I am honored to introduce our moderator for tonight, CAHSS Senior Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Islamic Studies, Dr. Andrea Stanton.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our colleagues. And as Dean Gonzalez noted, each will be speaking for between 10 and 15 minutes on their recent work and its impact on the public good and in DU and the broader community. We'll be going in alphabetical order this evening. So our speakers will go one after the other, so I'm going to introduce them all now. Our first speaker will be Jared Del Rosso, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology, who will be speaking on Teaching Toward Hope, What We Can Learn from the Study of Denial. Our second speaker will be Rafael Fajardo, Associate Professor in Emergent Digital Practices, who will be speaking on Artful Games, Gameful Art. Our third speaker will be Helstosky, who's professor in the Department of History, who will be speaking on Students as Researchers, Preserving the Life Histories of Colorado Veterans. And our final speaker will be Paige Lloyd, assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, who will speak on examining race disparities in pain care from a social psychological perspective. So I'll turn the floor over to them. Please join me in welcoming them all, starting with our first speaker, Jared. Joe, I can reintroduce you all with the correct. Okay. So we are not actually going in alphabetical order. I'm going to give you the updated order right now because the slides have been put together and we are going to adjust. And the order is a mystery, but the mystery will shortly be revealed. At some point, we could just mix it up. You guys could each have somebody else's slides and we'll just see how you do. And that will really highlight the cross-disciplinary richness of this college. Okay. Okay. All right. We believe that Carol Helstosky is going first, and we're going to look forward to seeing whether the slides match. And if not, if the slide matches. And then after that, we're going to see who's going after that. But all the four speakers who I introduced will be speaking. The order will be revealed in the appropriate time.
Yes, I'm first. Thank you. So if I just go ahead to the next slide. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thanks to CAHSS and to Marketing and Communications from CAHSS and my fellow panelists for talking today about their work with communities. I look forward to hearing from everyone and for the conversations to follow. I stand before you a little bit dazed because I've been frantically trying to finish a book manuscript for submission to a publisher going in, fingers crossed, next week. And I am due to return from my sabbatical in spring quarter. I'm talking today mostly about my teaching, less about my research, but my teaching on veterans issues, which seems a long ways away intellectually from my existing scholarship in modern Italian cultural history. I am a historian. I write about subjects like Italian food, and this most recent project, the manuscript that I'm finishing, A History of the Modern Italian Market for Antiquities. And so you may find yourself asking, what do pizza and antiquities have to do with veterans? Nothing. This interest, my teaching and then later scholarly interest in veterans, is relatively recent, meaning within the last 4 or 5 years. I also, just for clarification, have no personal connection. I am myself did not serve in the military. My father was a veteran, but like most veterans, never talked about it. I did not, before working on this project, have close contact with veterans organizations. I was drawn into this type of work largely by circumstance, I suppose, though I think I can briefly describe 3 really important elements that came together for me to get me to work on this project and to make it feel like a worthwhile experience. And the first big one was, of course, financial support. Several years ago, I began receiving emails from the National Cemetery Administration of the Veterans Administration, the NCA, asking me if I would think about working on something called the VLP, or Veterans Legacy Project, program. This is a government contract to promote the lives and legacies of veterans buried at military cemeteries across the country. And it's focused on universities and colleges to provide a research-based curriculum for students. So that was important first. Second was having great colleagues to help me with this project. Professor Elizabeth Escobedo, I found out, also received the same emails around the same time. And we had a conversation in the hallway outside the history department and said, have you been getting these? I've been getting these. Let's think about it. Let's talk to them. And lo and behold, we applied for VLP funding and received 4 years worth. And through that, we've been able to work with students. After the first year, where we put on an in-person exhibit in Anderson Academic Commons, we asked Professor Esteban Gomez to help us out with making some of the student research go virtual, represented as live. I show you here just a little, this is my only slide, the website morethanAheadstone.org, and I encourage you in your spare time to take a look at it. It is 100% of the content has been determined by student researchers. So that's not only the biographies of the veterans, but they chose how to represent, how to organize and group them, and what to say about them. So I'm grateful to my colleagues for this. And then third is having the third circumstance or factor is having willing students to sort of jump in and participate in this project. The project is a daunting one. There are almost 150,000 individual graves at Fort Logan. We were given a spreadsheet and told to make some sense of it. And the students, I was super surprised by this, maybe not that surprised, but delighted that the students jumped in. They were really eager. This project gave them new research skills that they didn't know they had, a lot of genealogical work, but also stuff that students are really good at. They were excellent at tracking down family members of veterans via Facebook, right? In ways that, Facebook tracking and stalking or whatever you want to call it, they found out so much information about every single veteran that they researched. It was really impressive. They also were very interested in looking at ordinary veterans. They were not immediately drawn to the most decorated veterans or famous veterans, but ordinary veterans, or perhaps veterans from minoritized backgrounds. They were interested in them. They loved the personal ways in which they could contact family members and talk to them about a veteran, so they improved their oral history skills. And they also were really interested in exploring aspects of history through veterans' eyes. The very first year, a student came up to me and said, I've been alive the entire time the United States has been fighting the global war on terror. I know nothing about, what goes on in Iraq and Afghanistan. I want to look at veterans who fought in those wars and sort of try to understand those conflicts. So overall, since we've been working on the Veterans Legacy Project, students have published their biographies on the website, and they've become really engaged, not just in the research, but in the whole process of doing and understanding history. And they've been recognized by the NCA nationally. Their work has been published in the DU Undergraduate Research Journal. They've given tours of Fort Logan through TEDx and delivered classes through the Osher the Osher Center, and also spoke at the Golden History Museum and to numerous veterans organizations. So in those 5 years that I've worked with students on and off, they've done a lot. And have really developed quite a bit of confidence in what they do. Sustained ties with one of the groups that we spoke with led to a very different project for a class that I taught last summer, something called the Honors Burial Project. And I'd like to speak a little bit about that this evening. The Honors Burial Project is work that Vietnam Veterans of America, the Local 1071, does. They are interested in talking to owners of funeral homes and mortuaries that might have unclaimed cremated remains of veterans. And so they have been, when they locate these unclaimed cremains and identify them as belonging to veterans, they then ensure that they get an appropriate burial at Fort Logan. And they sometimes struggle with this project for various reasons. So I set up a class, and students worked in the spring of 2022 to assist them. And again, as with the VLP, I didn't anticipate the impact that this class would have on students. I brought in a lot of veterans to speak to the students. I am extraordinarily grateful for Vietnam veterans who came in and talked to the students and were very honest about their experiences. I'm also very grateful to Damon Vine, who's coordinator of veteran services here at DU, who came in at student request and talked to us about recent veteran experiences and DU student veterans. The class had a profound impact on several students, not just in terms of working with veterans for the greater good for this project, but also on them personally. I had one student who was enlisted in the Navy and was called back to duty in the summer, and he volunteered to be on to work on veteran funerals at a local cemetery near where he was stationed. Another student became very interested in family members who were in the Vietnam War, wrote a fantastic essay and got a scholarship from a Vietnam veterans organization just by virtue of being in that class. And yet another student made what I would consider an extraordinary commitment to do an internship at the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency Laboratory in Nebraska, analyzing and identifying and writing about veteran remains that were recovered mostly in Europe. I was surprised to find out that there are still over remains of over 20,000 American veterans still lost out there somewhere from World War II alone. And the experience in this class kind of shifted our attention away from documenting the lives and legacies of buried veterans to trying to sort of wrap our heads around a larger issue, a problem of why some veterans don't get buried but remain forgotten. Connections that we made in this class led to two more potential future projects. One is I've been contacted by an organization called the United Veterans Coalition, which is an umbrella group of veterans organizations in Colorado. It's rather unique. It was founded by Vietnam veterans, including a DU Law School alumni, Dean K. Phillips. And they would like us to start exploring how students can begin to write a history of veteran activism in Colorado, things for, activism for a right to work and also healthcare, among other issues. And then secondly, we are thinking about working with DU veterans to sort of collect and preserve their oral histories of their experiences and keep them in special collections. So those are future projects that I look forward to jumping back into once I return to teaching full time. And then just very briefly, this is not just all about teaching, but I find that my work with veterans organizations has really affected my future research trajectory. And I have long been curious about the role of the US military in Italy during World War II. It was so different from the other European front, the Franco-German front. It was, military historians say, it was far more like World War I. It was a stalemate, heavy in artillery, lots of casualties. Over 30,000 American soldiers died in this campaign. I proposed, and during my sabbatical, had the great fortune to be able to go in the fall to the National Archives in College Park on a faculty research fund grant, where I researched the founding, right, the organization and the history of the 2 military cemeteries that are located in Italy, dedicated to US soldiers. And in the winter, I got the chance to go to Italy and visit these cemeteries. And that was from a Malioni Sea grant. The material from both of those trips sits waiting for me to turn it into a nice article about the history of the cemeteries, its origins, their origins during the war, their present state, and how they exist as centers for memory and building community between Americans and Italians. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I was particularly, if I could just say this, I was super excited. The director of the Sicily-Rome Cemetery, which is in Nettuno, Italy, I was thrilled to meet her and find out that she is working on some of the very same issues that we did at Fort Logan, representing different communities and the differing circumstances of the veterans there. So who knows where that will go. I'd like to conclude a little bit by trying to situate my teaching and my work with students and my research within a larger scholarly and public framework about veterans, to try to explain, who cares and why I do this. We usually, to make a broad generalization, tend to think about veterans as having a privileged status in society. They are celebrated on holidays. Wartime military service can be idealized as a marker of civic duty, right? Thank you for your service, et cetera, et cetera. My students last spring discovered that veterans as a community were marginalized. They worked with Vietnam veterans who didn't know what benefits that they had. And the students understood how difficult it was for veterans to try to understand or even recognize those benefits, much less claim them. And how hard it is for veterans to organize and ask for things for themselves. And for 5 years, my students and I have also tried to grasp how veterans are not a monolithic group. Within the category of veterans are groups of marginalized veterans, former service members who for various reasons have been denied by veterans organizations, ignored by politicians or the public, and neglected by scholars. The historical legacy of marginalized veterans teaches us that veteranhood can be an unequal social construction, elevating the status of some over others. My students have faced some really difficult questions about how to represent the many experiences of veterans, yet they have also developed very meaningful relationships with veterans over time, something I don't think anyone anticipated before signing up for any of the classes or summer research programs that we run. And while my engagement with veteran communities was initially due largely to circumstance, it is now a more firmly engaged scholarly and pedagogical project, opening up new teaching and research trajectories I never anticipated. Thank you. I don't know who's next. Is it Rafael? Okay. Should we try for the next slide? Huh. That's you. Oh.
Hello, y'all. I'm Rafael Fajardo. I make video games as an art form. And this is my talk. I've set myself up so that hopefully I won't go over, and I've given myself some prepared comments so that keep myself on track. I have shared here, I've only got a couple of slides, and I'll provide context for the images that you're about to see. In January of 2022, I was planning the field work for my sabbatical. I received an invitation to spend a month as one of the inaugural Latinx visiting artists at the famed Anderson Ranch Arts Center. This is up in Snowmass Village, not far from Aspen. It's like 5 minutes from Aspen. The invitation was also extended to San Antonio-based artist Ricky Armendariz and we were there together for a couple of weeks. I got to spend a whole month there, and it was magical. They provided dedicated studio space and focused time to work on my next project, which is a video game that's very, very early in development. Here are, still, we don't have a video, right? Just the still, and that's okay. So part of what they did, I'll get to a more direct explanation of the video and the still here. So as my part, what I gave to them, they asked for 2 days of direct engagement during and 1 day of filming prior to my visit. There was 1 day of direct engagement with area middle school students from the Roaring Fork Valley, and 1 day of direct engagement with area teachers. Both of these in workshop format, where I tried to teach them the rudiments of video game design in a highly compressed time frame. On the same day as we worked with the teachers, they also had us participate in a panel conversation organized with Armendariz, myself, and Lillian Lara, a Denver-based artist, all moderated by Alex Sanchez, where we were exploring the what it means to try and find a Latinx or Latin American or Latino, Latina, Latine voice in art in the absence of having any sort of role models ourselves. We were a generation sort of prior to having access to role models. That lecture was recorded, panel discussion was recorded, and is available on YouTube at Anderson Ranch Art Center's website until the heat death of the universe, I think. The day of filming prior to my arrival was a kind of an extended, deep interview about my biography and my artistic practices. I'm going to go ahead and change the slide just to see what happens. With the purpose, and a snippet of that video became their social media. It was like 15 seconds of social media on Instagram to advertise the fact that there was now a Latinx artist. And then a really famous art critic gave them a thumbs up when he saw my video. And I thought that was really, really great, because it was the kind of thing you sort of dance in a circle, say, yay! But the bulk of what they did with the video was make curriculum, and this is sort of, we'll synthesize teaching, but in this case it's not about me. I taught there like for 1 day, 2 days, but what they were actually doing in parallel to my being there, working in this really luxurious ceramic studio, doing both pen and pencil drawings and moving them to a screen, was in parallel. They were writing curriculum about my art practice and my historical games that we made 20 years ago with my collaborative, to teach to the students in the middle schools and high schools of the Roaring Fork Valley. And I feel very humbled by the fact that they thought that my work was worth this. Their aim was interestingly modest, because they were going to focus the distribution of the curriculum in the Roaring Fork Valley. And I pointed out to them that because they made PDFs and they published it on their website, and that part of the website is public facing, they are in effect publishing and are now a source of dissemination of curriculum about underrepresented artists in the world. So there's curriculum about my practice and about Rick Armendariz's practice. They received 3 years of funding by a donor who's wanted to keep kind of a low key, so the funding source hasn't been named. And I tried to prod the executive director there that for this to have really, really lasting impact, they really need to endow this. And I think that their funder has the capacity to do so. And I was asking about how they're going to know if this is any, what impact, if it was any success. They didn't have success metrics to share with me. I'm an artist, and it's me asking about success matrices itself, kind of weird. But so I thought it's like, they're going to want to know, how do they measure if they can convince the funder, the donor, to continue donating so that they don't stop after 3 years. Because the demographic shift in the nation, the demographic shift in the Roaring Fork Valley is not going to change. It's not going to stop changing. And so biographies from underrepresented populations need to be more adequately served and recorded. And so I was like, I told them that they won't know until maybe, the middle schoolers if they go to college, right? So if those middle schoolers have learned this curriculum, they won't understand the outcomes until these young people grow up and go to college, and what they choose to study there. As an aside, I was at a small symposium at the Denver Art Museum a couple of years ago in relationship to a Meyer Center seminar. I had a piece that was in the Denver Art Museum then. There was an attendee who came up during a break and said that she had played the video games we made 20 years ago when she was in 5th grade. And she is now a college graduate who studied art and remembered. And so this experience helped me think about what would be a measure of success for the folks at the Anderson Ranch Arts Center. And it's like, how do you do the longitudinal study for something like this? And I don't know. I think that's really an open question, and it's well beyond my expertise. Let me see if there's one more image here. So yeah, the studio here on the y'all's right is a ceramic studio that was occupied for the last 20 years by the same person of Japanese origin. I have his name here. I wanted to honor him because it was very, very special to be in this space. His clay work is still in the space. Where is your name, Takashi? Oh, I've lost it in all of this, but at any rate, this on the right is my scribblings trying to figure out if I can even make a video game set in Colombia and any of the weirdness. The studio itself is here in the lower foreground. It was back when it was, I think 75 years ago, not yet surrounded by development. And so, yeah, I was in this little A-frame for a month, and it was really magical. I think I'll stop there and see if any time left for anybody else. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm up next. My name is Paige Lloyd. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my work, which is titled Race Effect in Pain Authenticity Detection. And I'll start by saying there's ample evidence that Black Americans receive substandard and less effective pain care than white Americans. So for example, when a Black American enters an ER, they're just about half as likely as a white American to receive opioid drugs to help them cope with their pain. And for those Black Americans who do receive opioid drugs, they're often accompanied by greater barriers or restriction to care. One example of that might be like a urine drug test. Researchers in my field of psychological science have really nicely demonstrated a number of structural and interpersonal mechanisms that are theorized to contribute to these race disparities in pain care. So structural mechanisms might be things like access to high quality hospitals, access to pain care specialists, and whether your local pharmacy even carries the drugs that you've been prescribed. Whereas interpersonal mechanisms include things that are pictured here, like prejudice, stereotypes about drug use, stereotypes about toughness, or providers' empathy gaps. But I think it's important to note that most of these mechanisms, identified both structural and interpersonal, are largely focusing on quantity or amount of care. But in addition to Black Americans receiving less pain care than white Americans, Black Americans also receive less effective and accurate pain care. So when it comes to low value pain treatments, so these are treatments that are deemed ineffective, potentially dangerous given their side effects, or cost inefficient, we're actually seeing higher rates of those types of treatments among Black Americans. So an example, Black Americans are subjected to more unnecessary surgery than white Americans, and Black Americans are actually more likely to receive opioid drugs for migraines, which is not a guideline-directed treatment. So I wanted to examine a new mechanism that I theorize might play into pain care disparities, but that focuses on accuracy of care rather than quantity of care. So today I'm going to talk about my work examining whether people lack the ability to discern authenticity in Black relative to white individuals and how that might translate into inaccurate care. Before I move on to the studies that I want to present today, I'd just like to give an example, a real world example of how failures in pain authenticity detection might manifest in the real world. So as a content warning, I'm going to talk about an instance of a medical failure. So in 2012, a 29-year-old unhoused Black woman entered a local hospital in St. Louis complaining of lower leg pain so intense that she could barely walk. An X-ray revealed no visible signs of injury, so she was released without treatment. When she refused to leave the premises, continuing to urge doctors that she really required treatment and that she was in very severe pain, doctors began to suspect that she might be drug seeking, at which point they called the police. She was arrested for trespassing and taken to jail. She died on the floor of her jail cell less than an hour later. An autopsy revealed that she had had blood clots in her leg that migrated to her lungs, causing a deadly pulmonary embolism. So medical providers fail to recognize genuine suffering. They could contribute to more human pain or even mortality. And this is just one example of an avalanche of evidence that people of color and Black women in particular are being denied access to pain treatment and life-saving care. But it doesn't seem like a reasonable solution to just tell providers to give more pain treatment. The Department of Health and Human Services estimates that over 90 people die every day in the United States from opioid overdose. So for providers, it's a really difficult task of identifying pain authenticity. And in the talk I'm presenting today, I'm going to argue it might be acutely difficult when considering race. So when thinking about how race might affect pain authenticity detection, I have two sort of theoretical groundings and hypotheses. The first is that perceivers may exhibit an own race advantage. Own race advantages have been demonstrated in a number of interpersonal sensitivity tasks, and that looks like somebody being better at recognizing interpersonal cues in their own racial group members as compared to cross race group members. Alternatively, we might see a majority group advantage. A majority group advantage would be evidenced by people, regardless of their own race, performing better at interpersonal sensitivity tasks for majority group members, in this case, for example, white, as compared to Black individuals. So to test, in the first three studies that I'm going to present, we wanted to try to understand whether race effects might emerge in pain authenticity detection. And so we recruited a number of participants to our lab. They viewed videos that we had created of people exhibiting genuine and fake pain. Some of those folks were Black, some white, and they were shown an equal number of real expressions and fake expressions. Our participants were asked to generate a veracity decision. So is this real or fake pain? And from their decisions, we calculated sensitivity as our metric of pain detection ability. So depicted here on the y-axis is sensitivity. Higher values indicate better ability to discern between real and fake pain. And that is, this metric of sensitivity controls for response bias, so just a tendency to say real or fake more frequently. And so when we're thinking about white participants in this first two studies have white participants in them, both the own race advantage and the majority group advantage predict that white perceivers will perform better for white targets as compared to Black targets on our pain authenticity task. And that's what we find in study one. In addition to this effect where white perceivers are performing better for white targets than Black targets, we also see performance actually below chance for Black targets, which could indicate that perceivers are picking up on cues, but misinterpreting them. In study three, we wanted to try to pull apart that own race advantage and majority group advantage prediction. So here we recruited Black perceivers as well. And now we have distinct predictions for these two theoretical models. The own race advantage predicts an interaction between perceiver and target race, such that white perceivers will perform better for white targets than Black targets, but Black perceivers will perform better for Black targets than white targets. The majority group advantage just predicts main effective target race better performance for the majority group, in this case, white individuals, than the minority group, in this case, Black individuals. And what we found in study 3 was just a main effect not qualified by an interaction with perceiver race, whereby perceivers showed better pain authenticity detection for white as compared to Black targets. So across these first 3 studies, we're starting to see some evidence of potential race effects in pain authenticity detection. In the next 2 studies I'm going to present, we wanted to extend this work to more intense expressions of pain. There's lots of good things about our lab-created stimuli, including lots of control, but they're an unsatisfying parallel to the types of pain that I was talking about at the beginning of this talk that are creating those race disparities in pain care. But creating intense pain displays in the lab is not possible, and any existing pain detection databases out there don't feature racial diversity. And so we had to get creative in trying to address this question. And ultimately, what we decided to do was create a database with soccer players. And soccer players are a good fit for this task because, like many professional athletes, they have high rates of injury and painful experiences. But they're also known for a particular behavior, flopping or diving, in which you might fake pain or an injury in order to get a favorable call on the field. So in studies 4 and 5, we created sets of stimuli about soccer players. In study 4, we controlled for the identity of the player across veracity of the expression. So every player contributed both a genuine and fake pain display. That's going to control for characteristics of the face like trustworthiness and also player reputation. And then in study 5, we instead are controlling for intensity of the injury across race. This is really important because past pain authenticity literature has shown that more intense displays of pain expression are easier to discern pain authenticity from. So if we didn't control for this, an alternate explanation could be maybe the white folks that we have in our stimuli are just experiencing more intense pain, and that's why they're easier to read expressions from. And so here we're matching across race verbatim for the injury that this player experienced. So ACL rupture could only be paired with ACL rupture, not knee injury and not ligament rupture. And then we're also going to match as closely as we can the number of games that this player missed as a result of their injury and the number of days that they were listed on their injured players list. Okay, so then the results for these 2 studies are depicted here. Accuracy for study 4, this is because we had a limited number of stimuli, so signal detection analyses or sensitivity is not possible to calculate. And then sensitivity again in study 5. In both studies, what you can see is better performance for the white targets as compared to the Black targets, mirroring the previous 3 studies. So the value of study 4 and 5 is really trying to extend this work to be more generalizable to the types of pain expressions that might be contributing to race disparities in the real world. The final 2 studies that I'm going to show in this line try to move this work a little closer to the medical context. And so here we're going to examine treatment recommendations and recruit a sample of medical providers. So in study 6, we recruited participants into the lab and they viewed the same soccer player stimuli as study 5, but they were not told that these were real or fake expressions. Instead, they were just asked how much pain care would this person require in order to relieve their pain. We used the World Health Organization pain ladder from no drug treatment to strong opioid drug treatment. So here on the y-axis is treatment recommendations. Higher values indicate more intensive treatment. And then on the x-axis is target race, and in the legend is the veracity of the expression. So what we'd really like to see is people giving more pain treatment to real expressions as compared to fake expressions. We see that pattern for white targets, but not for Black targets. So in the treatment of white targets, we're seeing higher pink bars indicating more pain treatment for real versus fake pain. But for Black targets, there's no use of veracity information in pain treatment decision-making. You might also notice there's a main effect of target race, such that Black targets overall received less intensive pain treatment, mirroring the national statistics as well as existing social psychological work. But I think what's really important about the work I'm presenting is that this main effect of target race is qualified by an interaction with veracity. That interaction is 10 times larger than the main effect, and that really drives home that there might be some value in examining accuracy of pain care alongside just quantity of pain care. The final study that I'm going to present recruited medical providers, and they went through the same procedure as studies 1 through 3. So they viewed those lab-created videos. And among these folks who either recommended or directly prescribed pain treatment as part of their job, we again see better performance for white as compared to Black targets, sort of extending this work to the people who are responsible for making these important decisions. So in some, we see some evidence for some shortcomings in reading the pain cues of Black as compared to white individuals. We see that's the weighted effect size across all studies. And we see these effects emerging across participant samples. So we have online undergraduate and medical provider samples. We see it also across perceiver race, at least in study 3, which could be initial evidence for majority group advantage, and across stimulus sets. Both are a lab created controlled stimulus set and a number of soccer player more intense stimulus sets. So sort of thinking back to where I started this talk, that national tendency for Black Americans to receive poorer and less accurate pain care, this work suggests that doctors may lack the sensitivity that they need in order to understand or correctly read their Black patients versus their white patients' pain. And given that pain treatment is so essential to psychological and physical health and mortality, I think this is a really important contribution or direction forward for understanding pain care equity. So if you're interested in this work, the link at the top is for the full article and all the details about the methodology. If you'd rather see one talking more about future directions and implications and sort of a public-facing article, this is a blog post at the bottom. And then the last thing that I'd like to do sort of before wrapping up my talk is I have just 2 more slides. One is to tell you just a little bit about the next steps in my lab in this line of work. So we recently got an NIH K01 award from the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. And this work is examining pain treatment biases and the race perception mechanisms that might feed into those biases. So we plan to work on this for the next 5 years. Very fortunate to have a large and formidable and interdisciplinary team helping with this work. So I hope to come back in the future and maybe catch you up on some advances that we're hoping to make on pain care equity. And then finally, I'm not the only one doing this work, and I'm certainly not the most impressive person doing this work. So I wanted to take a moment to just highlight some of the other voices in this area. So these are a number of women, scholars of color, sexual and gender minority folks, junior scholars, and they're all doing incredible work in pain care and healthcare disparities. So I think if you found my talk interesting, these people are really going to blow you away. And with that, I would just like to thank my collaborators who helped me collect the studies that I presented at the beginning of this talk, my funding agencies and support, and of course, my lab, the Social Detection Lab. Without them, this work would not be possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. My name is Jared Del Rosso. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology here. And the title of my talk is Teaching Toward Hope, Lessons from the Sociology of Denial. And what I'd like to do is share some thoughts about teaching and learning that kind of come from the intersection of my scholarship and my teaching here at the university. One of the best things about working here, being a faculty member here, being specifically in this college, is that so often our scholarship and creative activities animate our teaching, and our teaching then animates our scholarship and creative activities. I mean this in a few ways. I get to teach on a lot of the topics I research, so I get to bring them into the classroom. My students talk to me about them, the conversations that we have about these issues then sharpen or reinvigorate my scholarship. But I want to talk about a slightly different dynamic here between my scholarship and my teaching. I've spent about 15 years researching and teaching on the dynamics of denial, particularly, though not exclusively, denial around human rights crimes and human rights violence. This has led me to ask particular questions about pedagogy, especially about teaching on difficult topics during difficult times. The work has led me to wonder about the role of emotions in teaching and learning, and about the possibilities of hope to enrich the teaching and learning experience. And finally, I'll just add that I write about a lot of this in a chapter that will appear in a book later this year called Emerging Stronger: Lessons Learned from the Pandemic. That'll be out from Rutledge. To provide a little bit of background here, I joined DU in 2012. I had studied the dynamics of denial of torture in US politics. This was my graduate research at Boston College. This informed 3 courses I taught here: an FSEM on torture, a sociology and criminology elective on state violence. And then starting in the winter of 2016, my course on the sociology of denial. This was a course that extended beyond the politics of denial to encompass denial in social interactions, organizations, politics, and culture. So I designed this course in winter 2016. I remember fondly sitting in my 700 square foot studio apartment. The kitchen was the living room, was the office, on the floor with binders of work on embarrassment management, one form of denial, excuses and justifications, another form of denial. That became the class, which then became this book, which I published this past summer by NYU Press, Denial, How We Hide, Ignore, and Explain Away Problems. I finished the first full draft of the book in April. In April 2020. So think back to that month. That was the very start of our time dealing with COVID here. Denver was essentially shutting down. The university had just gone to remote learning. We didn't know what would come next. And of course, denial was part of that experience. Those troubled years would shape my revisions to the book once I got the reviews back from the reviewers, as well as the ways I brought denial to learners in several of my courses. I put up Cuomo because I'm from New York. I was a kid when his dad was governor, and my editor really praised him at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic as a contrast here to Trump. As we worked through COVID, we researched, we created, we taught and learned with our students. Many of us found exhaustion, worry, despair, anxiety, and grief with us in that work, and especially in this classroom, in our classrooms. Amid that, I retired my first year seminar on torture. I retired my elective on state violence. The weight of the material, coupled with the unease I sensed in our classrooms, my unease as well, made these feel increasingly unsustainable. And then for a few years, I taught a sociology elective on hope. It was always Tuesday, Friday at 8 a.m., which meant that it enrolled about 8 people. In some ways, that course became the mirror image of the course on denial. Denial addresses inaction, passivity, fatalism, hope addressed engagement, possibility, and change. So it's the intersection of those courses for me and the ways that the ideas in those courses interlock that I want to spend much of the rest of the talk on. But I also want to start with a disclaimer. Over our first full year living with COVID, I wrote an essay reflecting on teaching and learning amid the pandemic. I made the case in that essay that the challenges we tried addressing in our teaching then, some were calling it pandemic pedagogy, are endemic to our human condition: vulnerability, loss, trauma, grief. But I also want to be clear that I don't see our classrooms as either the primary cause or the solution to any kind of broader mental health crisis. I make this point in the essay. We will lose, we will grieve, we will be undone. It cannot be otherwise. No pedagogy can overcome these facts. Certainly, no mere teaching technology or strategy can either. I wrote, we cannot Zoom or Canvas or active learn our way out of COVID-19. We cannot Zoom or Canvas or active learn our way out of loss and grief. So the purpose of that essay, as well as I suppose this talk, is to draw attention to how we might recognize the social context of our work as educators, as well as the ways that our approaches to teaching and learning lead learners to engage or disengage maybe from the topics we teach. So with that, I want to kind of step back from the last couple of years to just talk about teaching and learning about difficult topics more broadly. Because anecdotally, I can say from my own conversations with colleagues that there's a sense that teaching on difficult topics often leaves all of us, faculty learners alike, in a bind. Learners become well-informed on the issues we teach on, the contemporary issues, the social problems we teach on, but they often feel exhausted by that learning. This exhaustion contains a complex mix of emotions: anger, outrage, sadness, despair. I'll give you an example from a course I've recently taught. We learned about the concept of alienation coming from Marxist sociology, and a student wanted to work with that in a project that they were writing. They wrote in their proposal, though, I've noticed that in sociology, we focus on how things function as they do. We criticize how things are the way that they are. However, it feels like it is just information and not necessarily an answer. So what now? For instance, what am I supposed to do with the information that I will forever be alienated from the things I do and make? That question of so what now comes up a lot, I think, sometimes with majors in the social sciences. To stay in the realm of the anecdotes, the Teaching Sociology Google group back in 2014, someone posted this on the on the message board asking for some positive sociology because they were saying that students were complaining that all the sad stuff that we learn is true. One of the replies affirmed this experience. I used to joke with my students, the person making this reply wrote, that sociology is not truly the study of everything that's broken, but in fact, it's often a challenge to find material to disprove that point, especially when you focus on inequality. But this isn't unique to sociology, and it's not only anecdotal. Here's a series of articles that talk about the need for hope in teaching and learning, or in subdisciplines related to environmental sociology and climate change. So we have sociology, we have geography, and we have environmental studies more generally. So with that, I want to kind of think about, how do we understand this? What's going on with our students responding in this kind of way? How do emotions and denial, and what can the sociology of denial tell us about this? My way of understanding this starts with the work of a sociologist at the University of Oregon, Kari Marie Norgaard, who in Living in Denial studied the responses of people in Norway to climate change. What Norgaard found through her interviews and through her field work is that a complex set of emotions drives denial. We have fear about the future. We have guilt about contributing to the problem. And we have helplessness in the face of trying to solve a problem which we view as too global, too systemic, too intractable to actually solve. All this leads to states of denial, Norgaard found, including and especially among believers. And I think this is an important point for what we think about what is happening potentially in our classrooms. What I mean by believers, I just want to clarify here, because when we talk about denial, we're often thinking of outright denial, this kind of classic form of denial. This isn't happening. Fill in the blank isn't real. COVID's not real. Climate change isn't real. Systemic racism isn't real. This isn't what Norgaard has in mind when she's writing about denial. She analyzes this, but she's talking about a different state. And I think a state that might be closer to the kinds of despair some of us were seeing in our classrooms. So we've got cognitive acknowledgement, the recognition that a problem is real. This is happening. This is probably going to slide ahead on me for whatever mysterious, wonderful reason. There we go. This is happening. I believe in fill in the blank, but I can't do anything. So it's better not to think about it. What we see here is a cognitive recognition of the problem. We have those complex emotions coming into play. And we have this idea that with those complex emotions, they're driving us to states of fatalism. And we're using strategies of avoidance. We're not thinking about problems. We're not talking about problems. We're not soliciting or collecting more information about those problems. When it comes to the classroom, this is particularly problematic for me because many of us want our students to be lifelong learners. But if they're mired in helplessness, we can't leave them in that state. It won't be possible to leave them in that state. Bear with me a moment while I make sure I'm on the right slide here. All right, so I'll talk about the possibilities of hope. To think through this, I want to define what hope is and what it isn't. My kind of thinking on this is informed by the book Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities by Rebecca Solnit. She wrote it originally in response to the Iraq War in 2003, 2004. They published a new edition in 2016 with a really wonderful new foreword. And in that foreword, she does a lot of work to define hope. She has this wonderful quote: "Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act." I love this phrase, spaciousness of uncertainty. For Solnit, hope is synonymous with uncertainty and the unknown. So she writes, "Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things we can know beforehand." Why I like this is because as educators, we don't need to be optimists to follow Solnit. I know very few social scientists who strike me as optimists, and I'm not an optimist. Indeed, Solnit distinguishes hope from optimism. Hope is a belief in uncertainty, while optimism is a belief in the certainty that the future will be better than the present. But Solnit, I think, very cleverly rejects pessimism as well, because that's a different kind of certainty, that the future is going to be worse than the present. So to follow Solnit, we must only remain open to the future and to the possibility of individual and collective agency and how they can make a difference. So what this amounts to for me, yeah, I don't know. All right, so what this amounts to for me are a couple of premises that we can start a pedagogy of hope from. I'll note that QR code has a list of references. It'll bring you to a website. I have a printout of it. I'll leave it up here too. So hopeful pedagogy is an attempt to address the complex mix of emotions Norgaard identified. Fear about the future, guilt about contributing to social problems, but especially helplessness about making change. The goal is to lead learners away from avoidance and towards sustained engagement with their learning and with social problems themselves. The approach is predicated on uncertainty, the uncertainty or openness of the future. As a starting principle, this requires only an agnostic position from us, not again a commitment to optimism or the belief that things will get better, but a commitment to conveying that the future is not yet determined. It affirms agency, individual agency, sure, but also especially collective forms of agency. And it can't be wishful thinking. It's built on the study of what the psychologist of hope, C.R. Snyder, calls hopeful pathways, the routes, strategies, or techniques of actualizing our agencies. For sociologists, that's often social movements, but certainly there are other ways for people to realize their agency. So those are just some of the big picture premises underlying pedagogies of hope. I can talk more about specific strategies. I wrote about that in the chapter that I mentioned at the beginning during the discussion if there's interest. And thank you for bearing with me with the magical slides.
These were such good talks that I forgot I was actually supposed to come up here next. I just wanted to sit and think. So thank you all to each of our speakers for sharing your work this evening. As I said, you've, I think, given us, certainly me, much to reflect on and to think about. We have about 20 minutes for questions and answers, including both from our online and in-person audience. We have a microphone, I think a second microphone. Yep, we got a second microphone for our in-person questions. And I believe my colleague Jake will read questions posted from our online audience. So I wonder if while we maybe collect questions or people think questions in their head, I wondered if I might ask the first question, which was, I really appreciate the ways that your work kind of collectively showcases some of the range that we have in our college, as well as the impact that CAHSS faculty make, whether it's in the lab, in the graveyard, on the ranch, or in the classroom. And so I'm just wondering, when you think about the projects that you shared with us this evening, what would you hope for in terms of impact in, say, 3, 5, or 7 years? And I know for some of you, we've heard you're on either a new iteration or a related project, so that might itself be one kind of impact. But however you define it, I'd love to hear what kind of impact you might like to see for the work that you talked about tonight in 3, 5, or 7 years. And I can. Okay, I'll keep this microphone.
Should I sit here?
Well, are our speakers visible?
Do you want me to stand up?
Yeah, I think you can come up. Yeah, we're flexible. We'll migrate.
So yeah, one direction that I really would like to go with my work is thinking about how to make it more applied. I've started to build a lot more connections with health services researchers and practitioners and providers. I think that's really been influential in creating the direction of my research program since I joined the DU faculty. I also feel like I'm very fortunate in my department to be surrounded by a number of people who are interested in health equity and very supportive in sort of my career direction going that way, because I was quite a basic social psychologist up until I sort of entered the health equity domain. So one thing that we're doing in my NIH funded program of research is a series of a simulation study, partnering with the Center for Advancing Professional Excellence at CU Anschutz. There we have like rooms that are set up to replicate medical center rooms. So the ones that we're working with are emergency room settings. And we'll bring in medical providers to engage with simulated patients, and we'll record their nonverbal and verbal behaviors and their treatment decisions. And I think that that's a step towards program of work that's less lab situated and that looks more at how these interactions are dynamic and multiply determined. So that's something I'd like to continue to do in my work. And I'm hoping that through the K1, we're also looking at intervention strategies. Really like to, by the end of, 5, maybe 7, maybe 8 years, develop an intervention that could be used with medical practitioners to improve pain care equity. So that's where I'm going. Anybody else?
I won't break up 3, 5, and 7. I just
It's just,
would
they were
probably
just,
like to
whatever
say,
time frame you're looking
in
for.
terms of thinking about veteran communities and what their needs are, they're huge. So I think one thing I would like to be able to do, I'm always listening to veterans when they come up and say, oh, what you're doing is really interesting. We have a project that you might be able to help us with. And I'm always willing to listen, but I think going on some sort of major venture to find more resources, because the funding streams have been largely from the VA, which is not consistent. And so trying to find more resources so that I can say yes to more veterans groups that have really engaging projects, I think, because I always find that there's student willingness to engage in the material, but we have limitations on resources. So that would be one thing I would want to do for teaching and for research. I'm just really excited to move into this project in Italy and find out more about looking through cemeteries or with cemeteries, excuse me, to find out more about US-Italian military relations.
So with my work on denial and that course, so the book and the course I like are both really about helping people perceive denial in the world so they can make decisions about what they want to do about it. And so at a very kind of, course objectives kind of way, both of the book and the class, that's kind of what I aim for, that at least one of these forms of denial that I teach on will stick with them. They'll still see it in the world when it happens. More generally, though, I think, I guess my hope and dream would be to myself internalize some of these things that I've learned from the classroom and from engaging with the scholarship as I design new courses or update old ones, to promote a kind of engaged form of learning that allows us to collectively work on social problems, which is generally what I teach on, without going past the precipice into disengagement, despair, and this kind of avoidance type of denial. So.
And I think in very, very briefly, excuse me. My aspirations have been and will continue to be to see more people and more kinds of people making more kinds of games, weird games, personal games. I've thought of having sort of regional voices and inflections based on personal biographies and personal narratives embedded in the game-like expression. And so if my work can help contribute to that in some small way, I think it would be great.
Thank you all. So we'd love to take questions from in person or online, for those who might have them. Okay, great.
I guess we can just go in order of the presenters. So Carol, what was the reaction to the Facebook stalking when your students were looking for this sort of intimate family information about veterans?
To clarify, it was not necessarily intimate family information, simply trying to find living relatives of veterans. I involved a kind of research and an approach to research that that I would say leans more towards social media than what we think about historians doing, which is going into the archives and looking at materials. We do, when we have taught the Veterans Legacy project, we do it in a series either in the summertime as like sort of a summer research group or as a regular history class. And a lot of the work that we do to prepare the students to write biographies, and we tend to sort of ask students what they're interested in. Some students come in and say, you know, I really want to look at veterans who fought in World War I, and that's it because it was so long ago. And I only want to use archival information and genealogy. I don't want to actually talk to people. Whereas other students, like the one that I mentioned, are much more interested in contemporary veterans. And so for them, research involves oral history. And we do train students in oral history and talk with students a great deal about how to approach sensitive topics, in particular with veterans, because there might be friends of veterans. But what I find about the students that is so amazing is that the kind of research that is needed for these biographies really plays into what I call young people's strengths, right? Like finding, and this came up last quarter when we were assigned to write biographies of these unclaimed veterans, the veterans with the unclaimed remains. They were there for a reason, which was what we found out in almost all the cases of the 8 veterans that we examined the histories of. They were the last ones left in their families. There was no one there left to claim them. And so that's really hard to find a relative or anyone who could speak about what this person meant when they were living on Earth. And so that's the kind of, I hope this answers the question, that's the kind of preparation that we do, but the students are extremely skilled in locating people who might be related to veterans.
Great, thank you. This next one is for Rafael. Video games are generally associated with young people in my mind. Do you find that to be true? And if so, how do older folks react to your work?
Well, I think that there's been a generational shift. So people who grew up playing video games are now in positions of responsibility and authority. And so I think if we go back 20 years when I first started crafting video games and then trying to do that as an art form, it was a great deal of friction, a great deal of resistance, a great deal of confusion. And it simply has required patience and understanding and you know, an openness to understand not only video games, but all games as a part of what it means to be human. Humans have played video games in the sort of historical record of going back at least 13,000 years with artifacts available to us. And probably more. My historical memory on this is lacking. We might go even further back. And so it depends on where the sort of entry points are to have that conversation about you know, what kinds of games did one play when one was younger? What kinds of games or entertainment experiences does one enjoy at the current point in their life? What kinds of experiences will they understand from younger people and younger audiences, younger participants playing? And I think of the range both, it goes all the way from backgammon, which is one of the oldest games that we have, to folks playing esports, which, you know, it's a sport, but they're playing Mario Kart competitively for money with sponsorships. It's so very, very interesting to have this breadth of range. And so we will have a breadth of age interests as well.
Great. We have one for Paige. What was the impetus for beginning this research?
I'm really grateful for this question because I kind of had an interesting interaction with my sister, who's a medical provider, that led to this project. So my master's thesis when I was in graduate school was on race influences on lie detection, and again, how people can pick up cues from in-group members versus out-group members. So I had done work on the topic of interpersonal sensitivity. I had also looked at smile authenticity and how individual differences and motives about suspicion played into people's ability to discern whether a smile was real or fake. So I had been in the interpersonal sensitivity kind of realm and also in intergroup relations, which is my sort of area of primary interest. But I was talking to my sister about her experiences as a provider, and she was talking about how there were cues that her and her colleagues had sort of agreed that seemed like when you might be on guard for giving somebody pain treatment. And I'm really appreciative to her and then also other people that she put me in contact with to have these like really candid conversations, because I think they drove home for me that there's something in this medical interaction that's so important for feeling like you're valued in the medical scenario and feeling like you're cared for by your doctor. And so I think those interactions with my sister were really fundamental in moving this work forward. I don't know if anybody caught this, but she's also a second author on the paper that ultimately was published on this work. So it's a great opportunity to have a publication with my sister as well. So thank you for that question.
I think we have an in-person question, so I'm going to walk the mic. Hold on a sec. We need you on the mic so that the Zoom folks can hear. But I'm bringing it to you, Nancy. So
I just had a quick question for Jared because I didn't realize his work overlapped so much with some an ASEM that I teach and some work that I do. And I'm now working on young climate activists and the mobilization of emotion in public space. And I just did 62 interviews with young climate activists around the world. But my question for you from the pedagogical angle is, how much do you think faculty need some training in emotion? In emotion and pedagogy. Like, I feel like since the pandemic, I feel like we always needed more than we got. And I feel like since the pandemic and with the level of students' anxiety, and kind of anguish and despair that they're in right now. And many of us are also in, like, if you think that in higher ed, we actually need way more training. I mean, maybe that's a loaded question, but it seems like you must be thinking about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with what you're conveying here about, prior to the pandemic, some need for an understanding about the kind of intimate connection between emotions and learning and the ways that they will or will not, our emotional responses to the material will or will not help facilitate lasting learning. I think for me, thinking about the impact of the last several years and the current moment is, I feel like I'm playing a lot of catch up. And I always kind of felt like I was playing a little bit of catch up. Like I'm always correcting the mistakes from the previous quarter and then making new ones. But now it does feel amplified because I don't have a sense of what it would mean, what it would have meant to have been, say, a first year student in high school versus a seventh grader versus a fifth grader versus a third. So this is going to be an enduring question for us, I think, as educators and as a university. And I think it'll be something that there won't be like one training, one answer, one approach. Yeah, so.
We have one more online question for you, actually. Don't move. I think this word was used on one of your slides, but what is the difference between avoidance and denial?
Yeah, so I think of just avoidance as one strategy of denial. One of the processes or practices that we use to try to filter out or keep at arm's length distressing information. And so there's a lot of different practices we use for it. My book, I imagine, I'm a bird watcher, so I imagined it as kind of like a field guide to denial, all the different forms that it could take. For me, avoidance is important in the context of this talk because in the classroom, we don't want people to avoid the topics. We don't want to leave people right at the edge of never wanting to talk, in my case, about human rights or violence or denial again. And so rather than just being kind of thoughtful about how I present the material so I don't lead people into that strategy is important. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm now going to be the microphone escort and take the microphone over to Roberta. Well, you do for the Zoom folks.
Okay, sorry.
I agree with you that faculty need training. And that we, as you were speaking, I was thinking how wonderful it would be for you to come into first of all, to train faculty to recognize, the recognition of, and it's so cultural and it's intercultural. We all know that we're talking about nonverbal communication here, right? We're talking about, does a smile to a certain person mean they're happy? Or, that interpretation, I truly could not tell if that was real or fake. When you put those up, I don't know how I would have answered. I don't know if people actually can be trained to recognize that. And then, we're known for our study abroad here at the University of Denver. So we send our students all over the world. And having taken students to study abroad, one of the major issues that they have is they don't understand the cues. And how do you train people to understand either the facial recognition or the gestures, let alone the color of someone's skin and how one reacts? It's a huge challenge, but I think we have an opportunity here that perhaps the dean could help us with. I, for one, feel that I really could use in languages, I could use some training to understand how my students are reacting and how are our students reacting to us. Do we videotape ourselves to see what persona we are giving off to our students? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it kind of crosses almost everything that all four of you have said.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be the microphone escort again and start with Paige in case she would like to say something, and then maybe Jared, and then also open it up to Rafael and Carol, because to your point, Roberta, we may all have thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks for raising that point, and I agree. I'm going to pull a little bit just from the area that I'm familiar with in psychological science. So from what I know in pain authenticity detection, as well as more broadly in interpersonal sensitivity, some things are helpful, like getting feedback when you're right or wrong. And unfortunately, we don't often get feedback, and medical providers aren't often getting feedback about whether their pain care decision making was right or wrong. But I do think there's structural changes that could be made in the medical field that would better allow us to track those decisions and hold providers, but hospitals, medical systems more responsible for when those disparities are emerging. So I think feedback's one. The other one that I think is important is diversity exposure. If you think about like where our top medical schools are and the diversity of the patient populations that they see, as well as their colleagues, we're not getting a lot of exposure to our trainees in like recognizing or even interacting with individuals who might be different from them in a number of ways, race included. And so I think if you look at our medical textbooks, they often feature a lot of white patients and very few exemplars of color. So those are places where I think the medical field might be able to get some leverage in training. I don't think that answered most of your questions, so maybe I'll pass it to the next.
So I guess when I think of emotions in the classroom even further, I have a particular perspective on it because in sociology, and sociology is done here, sociology and criminology, we have some very heavy classes. We have, I've had a student who would be taking denial with me. We'll have a long section on the Abu Ghraib torture scandal. They'll be alongside taking that class on potentially on victimology or homicide or both, or violence in society. And so for me, I think a starting principle is becoming aware of what word do I want? Just weight of that kind of content over and over again, both on ourselves as educators and also on the students we teach. I think by the time many of us get to the classroom, we're not inoculated to the topics we've taught, but we've stayed with them long enough that we've worked through, in many cases, not completely, but we've worked through some of those difficult emotions. And so being thoughtful about how we introduce it, how we talk about it, how we use things like breaks in our classroom, all kinds of little things can really make a difference too.
the way in which I would come to know my cousins. I was raised in the US. I'm an immigrant from Colombia. I would see them perhaps once every 3 years. There was once a 6-year gap between trips because flying a family of 5 to Colombia is expensive. The way we would come to know each other, we would sit down around a table and play a family rules version of continental rummy. And it was through those interactions that we got to reacquaint ourselves with each other's affective registers, our affective responses, and get to know what kind of a person we are through that gameplay. I think that and in one case, I remember we had like 12 cousins around this really large table, and it varied in scale from 4 people around a table to 10 people around a table. That the intimacy of that interaction in a very interestingly low stakes kind of circumstance felt very, very important to be able to come to understand the cultural cues that I did not have access to except from my parental units, who were the only exemplars of that, and just sort of broaden my repertoire of understanding. And so I think that there's a role here for how a number of different approaches in which we can take a stab at this.
Yes to everything that's been said, and add just a little bit more, which is next quarter I go back to teaching, and I'm teaching history of comparative fascism. It's going to be heavy, and it's a lot of delivery because there's a lot to cram in, and you leave students with all of that knowledge and need to think about where they go with it, taking breaks. I hear everything that you're saying. In contrast, interestingly, when I teach classes like the Honors Burial Project, which is a very heavy class, simply by having a lot of veterans come in and tell their stories, having the space to appreciate and listen, having silence as well, letting them speak was very important, taking frequent breaks. And this is just entirely anecdotal. I don't have a lot of data to support it. But I found that the students in that class could feel like they were contributing to helping these people by doing the projects that they came up with that they were comfortable with. And that kind of sort of active engagement, as opposed to kind of being passive recipients of, or more passive recipients of knowledge. And I think we've all seen that kind of sliding in after years of Zoom and Canvas and everything, that has been something where they tend to feel a little bit more hopeful in classes like that.
So it has been truly a privilege to spend this time together and to, again, hear about your work and think about the community aspects of it, large and small, and to be in community together in person and virtually. So thank you all for joining us today. Carol, Jared, Paige, Rafael, thank you very much again for sharing your work with us. I'd also like to thank our colleagues, Tyler McKnight, Jake Jensen, and our digital media services colleagues for helping plan, coordinate, and execute this event. And I'd also like to put in a pitch. We have many great events on campus, always from CAHSS and elsewhere around the university. But on April 20th, we are hosting our Harper Lecture, which features Dr. Nicole Seymour, who will be presenting a lecture titled Climate Crisis and Comedy Crisis. So I guess if you're looking for tips on the leavening of difficult topics without denying them outright or otherwise, again, please join us. We'd love to see you all there. I'll just close by wishing everybody a wonderful evening, and thank you again for being part of this event.